Today, we are hosting Dr. Mark Ranella to speak with us about writing. Dr. Ranella has taught writing and composition throughout his career, including his current role as writing coach for MBA students at Harvard Business School. His publications include Entrepreneurs, Managers, and Leaders, What the Airline Industry Can Teach Us About Leadership, co-authored with Nidan Noria, former dean of Harvard Business School. Mark earned a PhD in American history from Brandeis University and has taught literature and American history at Harvard University, the University of Miami, and the University of Tours in France. We are very honored to have him with us today. As the session progresses, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. You can raise your hand or you can put them in the Q&A box and I will help to field those questions to Mark. Dr. Ranella, over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan. And thanks to you and to Mehmed Ali for being such great hosts and helping me along with preparing for this talk. And I've felt very welcome all along. And thank you all for being here. I'm very curious to get your feedback, your ideas. This is a book in progress. I just sent this book to my editor, the first draft, just a couple of weeks ago. So I've been living this book up and down, in and out for many, many months. A digital review copy of the book should be ready in December or January. And as Megan mentioned, there is a link to an HBR article that will give you some really sort of deep insights into the approach. This is my first formal presentation to educators. Like I said, I'm really excited and your opinion is so important to me. And so if you have questions, please ask. Megan told me that she would politely interrupt me and I welcome those interruptions. So I want to get first, what are the main points I'm going to talk about today? And then, because we're going to talk about a lot of things, but this is the goal. First of all, three things. First of all, what is the one idea rule? Let me get the suspense out of that. It is every component of a successful piece of writing should express only one idea. So this idea or this approach can be applied to most, if not all, parts of the writing process. And I hope to give you a flavor of that. It's obviously too broad to go into all those corners of the topic, but I hope to give you a flavor of that. The main point, though, will be how to choose a theme so it has a clear focus. And this happens during the writing process, of course. And as an extra bonus, if you have that clear focus, this also motivates writers to write. It's just sort of a virtuous cycle. Once you start the one idea rule, lots of good things happen, I believe, in my experience using it with students. As Megan pointed out, I have a background in writing, published a couple books, and I took a hiatus from teaching as I was an editor at Harvard Business Publishing. And 4 years ago, I went back to teaching as a writing coach, as Megan mentioned. That led to the HBR article because in working with the MBA students, I found that this approach kept on working. And I thought to myself, well, if it works for them, it may work for a lot of other people. And so that led me to work on it, in different facets for the last 4 years. That led to the HBR article that you have in chat, the link to. And then I used that to pitch it to a publisher, Ben Bella Books. And they've been very helpful as well. So the title of this talk was Helping Writers Make Good Choices. And that's the thing. I think you all may know, either as writers or teachers of writing, that is the sort of $1 million question for a lot of writers. There's so many ways you can go left, right, up and down. How can we make this process as productive and interesting and intriguing for students as possible? We don't want them to be overwhelmed, but we want them to face choices with confidence and then get the best ideas from those choices, not run away from them. So, and just as an aside, there's many choices in choosing a cover too. You might want to ask yourself, like, what kind of cover art would convey the one idea rule, a single rule that can be applied to help writers deal with a lot of writing problems. And this came after a lot of deliberation. One of the interesting things, though, was the generation split. The kids I asked versus the adults my age had totally different ideas. And of course, I'd like to appeal to as wide an audience as possible. I don't want to alienate the younger crowds to whom this is the most useful. So I went with the younger look. And my son approved of this, who is a very good artist, and he's 18 years old. So we went with that. But the key thing here in this cover was that the covers came down to two images, one with quotation marks, with two quotation marks, and this with an exclamation point. And it was important to me to convey the idea of one idea, not two or more. So the exclamation point was where we went. Okay, next slide, please. So here is a table of contents of the first draft of the book. And I just wanted to give you an overview of this. It's split up into about 5 parts. We've got introductory material. Then my idea is to make this as modular and as easy to access as possible. So I start with basic concepts, go to intermediate, and go to advanced. So if somebody is just starting, they're a real beginner, they're not going to worry about, how do I apply this to slide presentations or something like that. They can just focus mainly on the first 6 chapters. So those deal with the basic concepts are titles, sentences, and paragraphs. So I have whole chapters on those topics, along with some exercises I've shared with you, I think, some experimental exercises. Then we go to intermediate concepts, and this is actually writing the paper. So the first part is the components. What is this made up of? And then the second part is, how do I write? How do I actually get started? And ideation, this is probably the most important chapter, chapter 4, because it's at the heart of what I like to talk about, that ideas are the key element of writing, and paying attention to them is the key element of becoming comprehensible to a reader. So that chapter 4 is very important. We move on to advanced concepts. So I talk about research papers quite a bit, which is a big problem for younger writers. I also talk about judging and grading writing. Finally, in the appendices, I do talk a lot about applying this in really specific instances. So applying the one idea rule for ESL writers. The appendix 2 is applying the idea within an organizational hierarchy, mainly a business, but any big organization. And appendix 3 is for slide presentations. The tone of this book is generally aimed at students. Obviously, I want teachers to buy this and use it and in their classrooms, but I'm trying to talk to students. My model is my high school teacher, Jenny Krugman, from Coral Gables High School in Miami, where I grew up. And I was always impressed by how she had huge expectations for us, was great implicitly at focus, but she was extremely helpful. So it wasn't easy to get an A in her class. It was very hard, but she was always helping you with the apt advice when you needed it. And that's the person I modeled, and that's the tone I'm trying to convey. One element of this book that's interesting is in the introduction, you'll see it says Introduction and Quick Start Guide. And that came from my sister, who read this over, and she's a great editor. And she said, after people read this book, they may want to know, how can I get started? What's the first thing I can do? And that was a very good question. So I've created a sort of user manual within here so that you only have to read 44 pages of this book to get to its absolute necessary parts to get started writing. The rest, I think, is extremely helpful, especially if you have ambitions to keep on increasing your proficiency as a writer. But there's sort of a basic element to it, so people can get started quickly and started using this in a productive way. So next slide, please. So the overview of the talk, we'll go over 5 parts. Is one idea descriptivist or prescriptivist approach? What is it and why is it useful? where did it come from, how to describe it to students, and the importance of aligning of one idea, using one idea to evaluate potential paths in a document about aviation. So I am
Dr.
sort of
Connelly,
catering.
you have one quick question
Oh, please.
from Dr. Kelly Glasscock. When you say students, is this specific for undergraduates, or can I use this in my graduate level course?
You can use this in the graduate level course for, I mean, there's two ways you could look at it. I have a large section on research papers. So if people are embarking on that and maybe don't feel too confident about that, that would be very helpful. I also think this helps, maybe not in the sophisticated end of a graduate program, but in the clarity of what you're writing, right? Because when you jump into graduate level subjects, it can seem like a giant jungle that is very overwhelming. And I think my approach helps to hone your your writing so that that jungle turns down to like a little garden that you can cultivate and not be overwhelmed with. Okay, thank you very much for that question. So these are the 5 parts I want to go over, and again, thank you for your question. So next slide, please. So before doing this book, I wasn't aware, I didn't know the terms descriptivist and prescriptivist, but they do help sort of locate what kind of writing instruction manual I have. And also, you know, as I'm talking now or later, if you have some favorite books or manuals or approaches you've used for teaching writing and why you like them, I'd love to hear about it either now or following. But in this slide, descriptivist is, and I'm quoting from somebody who wrote this very well, he said it better than I could. He said, descriptivists describe systematically recording and analyzing the endlessly changing ways people speak and write. So it's sort of following trends in popular speech or writing. Whereas prescriptivists prescribe and sometimes proscribe, emphasizing rules and guidelines based on the conservation of customs. So a little more conservative. And that might be Strunk and White, which is pretty prescriptivist. Writing Tools, which is pretty popular writing book, which is sort of a kinder, gentler version of Strunk and White. And then towards the left, one of the favorite books I used when I was teaching writing, I don't know if any of you all have, but The Craft of Revision is a wonderful book. It's great, right? It's called Revision. It's not called Writing because it emphasizes that writing, any final product is the end result of many iterations. So it's a great, I love that heart it has. Now, I place my book slightly to the right of the middle because it is about a rule, right? I am talking about a rule as a central part of my book, but it's only one rule, and you can apply it in many situations and remember it, which is really key, I think. A lot of times when I ran into writing manuals, writing instructions, they turned out to be lists that are really hard to recall. And I was trying to think, you know, what kind of approach could be easy for a student to recall again and again and apply to their needs. So other reasons I came up with this approach was that, you know, the long list of advice that writing rules sometimes seem arbitrary. More recently, I observed with my own kids and anecdotally that some writing instruction has gone, you know, the sort of way descriptivist role where they really de-emphasize mechanics, maybe to the exclusion of mechanics sometimes just because they're desperate to get students interested in writing something. So what if I could come up with a methodology that was easy to remember, easy to apply, and tended to all these writing problems, and a rule that would orient students but not be overwhelming. And the ultimate goal is to get students, you know, quote unquote, psyched about writing. My role model, another role model at University of Miami was a writing instructor I worked for as a TA. And he would reward people with great ideas with a sort of exclamation like, yes, Mr. Jones, or yes, Miss McIntyre. And I want to do that same thing. I want to encourage people to follow their ideas, their enthusiasms, but not get lost in the process. That's why a rule is so important. It helps students feel confident about how they can practice. So we'll get to that more later. So let's move to the next slide, please. So second part, what is the one idea rule and why is it useful? Again, next slide. The reason why it's useful is because it has one primary tenet, right? It's a principle that can act as foundation for many other writing virtues that can be discovered and developed over time. So as I said, it's sort of your trusty compass. It may not tell you everything about how you need to go through a forest or a dense area that you're not clear of, but it does give you a clear direction. And I think that's one of its virtues. Next slide, please. So there it is, the one idea rule. As I said earlier, every component of a successful piece of writing should express only one idea. The one idea is useful from the student's point of view because the most persistent and widespread writing problem I've observed, I don't know about you all, and I'd love to hear your opinions, but the widespread problem I observed in my teaching career was students entertaining too many disparate ideas at the same time, which resulted in confusing papers, poor sentences, and paragraphs. So next slide, please. So the three major components of a paper that I mentioned earlier are a title, or its theme of a paper, the sentences, and the paragraphs. Now for books, we'd add chapters, and we'll see that in a little while. The title is the goal or the direction of the paper. And the sentences and the paragraphs are the means to achieve that goal. They also stress test the main idea in the title. Do the sentences make sense? And do the sentences start revealing other ideas? And that's sort of a wonderful treasure of writing that people sometimes discard because it might seem too hard for them. I'll get more involved in that later. But I want people not to fear the sort of difficult crossroads they sometimes face, but really assess them and try to learn from them. So next slide, please. So the one idea rule solves a problem that vexes writers who lack confidence. And I think the thing that a lot of beginning writers feel intimidated by is the distance between, say, writers they read in the Los Angeles Times or in a magazine or a book and their own abilities, right? And so good papers can seem purposeful like an arrow, as I said here, or cohesive like a pyramid, and that can seem daunting because, next slide, please. The writing process can feel like trying to straighten out the pasta in a bowl of spaghetti, especially if you lack confidence and you run into an issue that sort of surprises you or overwhelms you. Next slide, please. And the components of that spaghetti are multiple, right? You can have a false start. You start with an idea that peters out because you don't know much about it. It turns out not to be interesting. There's non sequiturs, there's contradictions. There are no ideas or maybe topics that somebody cares too much about, so they add too many things, or topics a writer doesn't care about, so they don't have any energy. Again, one of the big problems I've met a lot of times is too many ideas. For instance, at Harvard Business School, they often teach many sort of formats or frameworks to answer specific business conditions. Maybe one class will go over 12 frameworks over the course of a semester, and one framework offers one solution. But one of the MBA students I was working with wanted to use 2 frameworks. And I said, well, why do you have two frameworks for one question? And she said, well, I can do framework A and I can learn something with framework B. And I was saying, well, you have to choose. And we really had a long talk about that because she wanted to show off all the things she knew, but it wasn't helping to answer the question. So too many ideas often, and I met that problem many times earlier in my career, but I met it again there. So how do you create that arrow or pyramid out of that bowl of spaghetti, right? When you're a writer, and especially one that lacks confidence and thinks, oh, I can't write, or I've never gotten a good grade. And you write again and you run into this problem. What is your solution? And I think the one idea rule, the way I talk about it, helps them to know two things. You have to understand the goal of what you're aiming for in your paper, but you also have to have flexibility as you're striving for that goal. And that's one of the main takeaways I'd like you to take from this talk. That combination of sort of the vision of a solid ending, but understanding that the process can be very fluid. Next slide, please. So here is introducing this pyramid as a way to talk about that goal, that vision. So here are the essential components of the document: a sentence, paragraph, and a title or theme. And the next slide, please. So the key thing that makes a good paper is when everything aligns, right? When the title leads to paragraphs that are supportive of that title, that are related. The sentences likewise support the paragraphs. Everything is of the same sort of color, or and is moving towards the same goal, which is helping the title. Next slide, please. But there is a process of discovery during composition. I see a question in chat. I think do you mind if I take that, Megan?
Yes, please do. Let me read it for you. Does the book talk about how to weave in research while staying on the topic? Sometimes young writers do not understand, or how to align the research within their theme.
Absolutely. I have a whole chapter on research papers. In fact, I imagine that my editor will make me cut it because, or cut parts of it, because it's 1/5 of the book. It talks about research in expository writing and also persuasive writing, and also in larger problems like an open research paper on cutting edge research in X or Y domain. How do you cut it down to a manageable scope so that you can write about it with confidence? Yes, indeed, I talk a lot about that, knowing that that's a major part of a student's and education, and one of the major difficulties. Thank you for that question. So the process of discovery, getting back to that, and as you know, when you're writing, you may find topic B after you started with topic A that may either have a better view, more interesting, more up to date, some reason why it may challenge, or maybe maybe it's just a smarter way of answering a question. Some way it'll challenge that first title. So the possibility is using that to recreate or reconstruct an argument, starting with a new title and then trying to align things to that. Next slide, please. Like for instance, I just came up with a topic a random topic, responding to the question, how can manufacturing costs be reduced? And imagine we have a theme about negotiations with suppliers. That's the best way to reduce manufacturing costs. Next slide, please. But the writer may discover in the process of composition that a more important problem concerning communicating design specifications to suppliers is coming up. This could lead to complete revision to support the discussion concerning the more important issue. So, this happens all the time where, you delve into one angle and then something else comes up that, makes you rethink what you might be doing. Next slide, please. So this then challenges the title, right? Go to a possible revision and improvement. You don't know, maybe it's this, or maybe it's some other combination of ideas. Next slide, please. But what happens often, because people put in time to their first theme, they don't want to put more time into another one, even though it might be more promising. And what happens is that this is a revision or improvement that can be abandoned. And this is, there are dangers of being too committed to your first theme. I know in my dissertation, I started off on a theme. I have a history PhD that led me into philosophy. And I did that for about 6 months. And then I realized I am doing the wrong thing. And I'm glad at that moment I pulled the plug and started a new topic. It was tough, but it had to be done and led to a much better outcome. So I'd be really curious about any advice you give about revising your draft, any good stories about dealing with second or third drafts, or student anxiety about dealing with drafts. I know there's a lot of that too. Okay, next slide, please. So just some conclusions drawn from this previous talk about with the pyramids there. So this one idea gives writers the courage to make big changes in their arguments, I think, because they start out with understanding the importance of alignment. And knowing that leads to accepting uncertainty during the writing process, right? Because if they know, they can go off track, but they can realign, they're going to feel a lot less reluctant to take a chance on a second topic. And and this is maybe one of the most important or inspiring reasons why I'm writing this book, is the third bullet point here, is that unexpected discoveries or difficult questions are often the result of sustained thought and concentration, right? We want writers to cultivate this momentum in their thinking, not abandon it. But often, because people lack confidence in their writing, they may do that. Or if they have bad habits, and one thing I do talk about in the book is procrastination, then it's very hard to cultivate a topic this way. But if they don't procrastinate, and we can show them that it's worthwhile to get ahead of things and be open to new ideas and be able to react to them because they have time, then maybe we won't lose their momentum in their thinking. And I want them to deepen their thinking and not cut it off because it feels too risky. And finally, I would say that all experienced writers, I think, use the one idea rule implicitly, right? Everybody knows, however they go in the end, they need to have one focus at the end. And I think when people have been writing a lot, just have that as a sixth sense. But this methodology only makes it explicit. And I think it's great to make it explicit for inexperienced writers. Next slide, please. Okay, so where did this come from and what is it responding to? So this came in 2 stages. One, it was mainly during my time as a college teacher and when I was grading papers. Now, I was looking over some of the literature and the links to your website concerning writing, and one of your writers or one of your teachers said it as well or better than I did, so I just quoted him. So next slide, please. So just in the late 2021, Dr. Anthony Fegan started talking about the same thing. And this sort of like a universe, maybe it's a universal problem that a lot of writing instructors have, right? Where he said, initially providing students feedback was exhaustive and exhausting. I focused on being very detailed, getting every detail in my comments. It was time consuming, and I'm sure students stopped reading exasperated. He realized targeted is better. Feedback is tuned to the stage and the writing process and the stage of the student's development. And I couldn't be more in agreement. And that does articulate a lot of the motivation I had for trying to find a methodology that students could use. And when Dr. Fegan mentions targeted, I think this is an echo of my one idea rule, because one thing I tell students is that they need to write in a syntax that is comfortable for them. And that goes to what he was saying is that feedback is tuned to their stage in the writing process. If they can be honest about where they're comfortable, that's where they should start and then grow from there. Don't worry about sounding smart, which a lot of people do worry about. Worry about being clear. And I think Dr. Fegan and I had the same motivation. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, after I put this idea in mothballs for a little while, but came back to HBS as a writing coach in 2018, I found, students found it to be very helpful. And some typical student problems were people who were good at quantitative work sometimes neglected writing. So they were brilliant in some ways, but couldn't get their ideas across to other people. Or some people were great at verbal communication, thinking on their feet, but had no patience for writing. There was also ESL writers, lots of people from outside the US going to Harvard Business School, and a sort of general being intimidated by the difficulty of cracking HBS cases, which is very hard. So the approach I've taken with that is to separate the analysis from the writing. And with me, I usually have them write an essay right after a class that they've really loved, so they know everything about the topic, but they can just focus on the writing. And I found with that one idea rule, once they know a topic well, they use that one idea rule to keep them on track. So, yeah, got another question. What I mean by syntax? I guess by syntax, I just mean sounding smart. For instance, having a sort of a fancy, either a very complex sentence or some sort of word choice that draws attention to your writing, something that is used to convey intelligence rather than the idea itself. And I try to tell people that those moments of eloquence usually come as a result of a lot of hard work that is best done in simple sentences, and that the eloquence comes occasionally, but it's built on those clear ideas. So that's what I mean by syntax. It's just word choice and word order that might be used to be a symbol for intelligence. Let's see. And then, next slide, please. So the lessons I've learned working with MBA students, here's the first one, and about downstream versus upstream issues. I think grammar and syntax are usually downstream issues. Now, the reason I say this, and I think probably a good amount of people will disagree with me, but I don't think in the end I would disagree with most people. But I sort of feel that humans are good at grammar, right? Toddlers and little kids start making sentences and discerning sentences with high sophistication very early on. And if we couldn't all follow the same rules of grammar, we wouldn't be talking to each other, and we'd be running out in the street getting run over by cars or something because we wouldn't listen to our parents or something like that. Now, of course, what happens, grammar often fails though for two reasons. One reason I put here, when writers try to say too much in a sentence, paragraph, or paper, or they venture into topics that are quite sophisticated, that aren't day to day. We're good. We have good grammar for day to day things, but maybe there is a very difficult question about anything, supply chain, the immune system, child rearing, etc. Those require some more sophisticated grammar, but I think we all can start. Sometimes people start learning writing with grammar, and I think that is in the wrong order. And so one solution for a student was to start in your syntactic comfort zone. So I saw a question. Do you have an opinion of Harold Evans' book? Do I make myself clear? I don't, and I guess I should. And I'm very glad that you included that, and I will try to look at that. I know there is there's another book called something like Writing Short or Writing Clear, something like that, about the virtues of short sentences. I remember looking at that. That had some overlap with what I talked about. So anyway, getting back to downstream and upstream, I think grammar, for the purposes of students gaining confidence in the writing, is a downstream issue. Next slide, please. Could I have the next slide? Thank you. Let's see. The lack of focus is the main upstream problem, right? If students lack interest in certain topics, they won't care about explaining them, right? So I spend a lot of time in my ideation chapter about how to find an angle to a topic that interests you, no matter what the prompt might be. Now that might be a little bumptious on my part. Maybe not every topic is open to that, but most are. The other problem is if students are too interested in a topic, they can become self-indulgent and forget about maintaining focus for the reader. So they show you how much they know about a subject versus answering a specific topic about that subject. And a common result of that lack of focus is incomplete or run-on sentences. So, and we'll also, the talk will end with sort of a discussion that is related to the potential of becoming self-indulgent and how to avoid that in creating a theme that's focused. Next slide, please. Okay, how might the one idea rule be described to students with some sample exercises? I had some exercises. I'm not sure if you've had the chance to look at them. I want to talk about them a little bit because they are quite experimental, I think. And I'm totally open to suggestions about how to improve them, or if they are good, I'd like to know that. I haven't had the chance to use them with students, but they do follow the tenets of the one idea rule. So they're one idea rule exercises, but we'll see if they seem attractive. So next slide, please. Can you go back one, please? So again, getting back to this point, one idea rule favors clarity over grammar, clarity in individual components of a paper, which also improves grammar and syntax as a side effect, and clarity in how parts are connected. So that's important for alignment, as we talked about earlier in a paper. So the pyramid graphic demonstrated connection and alignment in the abstract. But next slide, please. But in my book, I try to show the reader exactly how these parts are interconnected, what they are, and how they work together. So this is a book about, the title is Adolescence and Holistic Health. And the left column talks about the components of a book. So it talks about the title, chapter, paragraphs, and sentences. But then I try to really show students how sort of these components interlock to support the title. So, and as you can see, I have arrows 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this is, I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, I'll read a little bit from my book because that states it more succinctly. So if the writer is keeping a steady eye on developing the main argument or theme set out in the title, then each part of the book will be related to the others. So in this case, the first sentence in chapter 1, arrow 1 at the bottom, describes the need to make a bridge between conventional and alternative medicine. The first paragraph where that sentence appears makes a slightly larger and related point of arguing that holistic medical techniques using the senses can be helpful for adolescents facing changes in their lives. This idea then relates to the theme of the entire chapter, arrow 3, pointing to the chapter, of the potential great benefit of applying integrative medicine to help adolescents maintain a positive state of well-being. Finally, this theme is one of 8 chapter themes, which collectively create an overview of holistic health for adolescents that was set out in the title. So I'm hoping to give students a real detailed idea about how all these things should interconnect in the end, if they want to make a really strong persuasive argument. Next slide, please. So how can one create writing exercises that focus on stating ideas rather than correcting grammar? As I say, this is a work in progress. So let's look here to the next slide. So my grammar in here is extremely simple. Essentially, the big thing I talk about is a sentence that's going to be clearly convey an idea, has a clear relationship between the subject and the predicate. And I make that point in those very simple sentences. I also, and later in the chapter, I discuss compound and complex sentences as useful tools to describe more complex phenomena. And I go over that in detail. I have a subtitle that says something like, because life is complicated, we have complex sentences. So try to put a little humor in the book as well. Next slide, please. So here's my little experimental 1 idea rule exercise, and I'll just read from the slide here. In the lines below, you will find various attempts at writing sentences. For a sentence to be viable, it must discuss only one main idea. The attempted sentences below will either have too many ideas, more than one, too few, which usually occurs in an incomplete sentence, or they will successfully focus on only one idea. Try to rewrite those sentences that need correction. So these 3 I was thinking of talking about. Little girl found her lost toy and cried for joy. Motorcycle repair is surprisingly lucrative, and I love comfortable shoes. A beautiful tree decorated with blooms and surrounded by birds. So next slide, please. So you can see I have the answers: 1 idea, too many ideas, and too few ideas. One thing I do try to do here is provide a long enough explanation so people really understand why, one sentence is successful and one sentence isn't. For instance, in the second one, I explain this is an unsuccessful sentence that is also grammatically correct. Grammatically speaking, it's a compound sentence, but the relation between the 2 ideas is not at all clear. So there's a wonderful sneaky way that something can be grammatically correct, but it's actually confusing. That was an exercise for a sentence. Next slide, please. And then I also tried to do exercises for paragraphs. One exercise, which is not here, which is I put I'd say a series of 4 to 6 short paragraphs, and I just smushed them together in one giant paragraph and said, where should paragraphs begin and end here and why, and then I provide an answer. Right here is another way to think about paragraphs, because paragraphs are sort of a mysterious entity. You can have several paragraphs in a row that deal with the same topic. Why did you stop in one place and start in another? So I just have people, students sort of look at paragraphs as an entity and think of the theme or the topic sentence and how it can work in different parts of a paragraph, in the beginning, in the end, in the middle, or perhaps just implied. And then I have two answers about that on the right. So that was my experiment with paragraphs. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're coming to the end. And this is the big thing I want people to come away with is the importance of alignment of one idea behind using one idea, forgive me, to evaluate potential themes in a document about aviation. Again, I'm catering to my audience here, but I hope you'll find this story interesting and that it also makes a point about my methodology. Next slide, please. So I just want to bring back and remind you about the earlier use of the triangle that I had here, where we, what do you do when you unearth two competing themes while you are writing, right? And you have two potential main topics. And with a warning at the bottom, a document cannot give equal weight to theme A and theme B, because you would come up with a document with two main ideas, not one. Next slide, please. So the options here are, now this is really important for people to know because, like I said, I want them to cultivate their thought, not abandon it because it causes problems. So one idea rule tells them you have to have a thing with one idea in the end. So you have three options. One, you can eliminate or subordinate that second theme and just go with the first one. That's fine. And I have an example of how one would subordinate theme B to theme A. Or you could eliminate or subordinate theme A and opt for theme B, right? If you want to. Or option three is find a new theme that can include A and B. You have a new overarching theme in which A and B can play a role. So if you liked those first ideas and didn't want to abandon them, you don't have to. You can put them on under a bigger theme. So that's what I want to say is like none of these ideas are wrong. But rather, how do you create an argument that is persuasive and focused? That is the real question. And which idea do you favor for whatever reason? So let's go into our particular story. Next slide. So we're going to review a narrative options in a story about aviation. And this is my great-grandfather, in fact, Cosimo Ranella, who was an Italian ace in World War I, if you can believe that. And he was this is a picture of him in the Italian Alps, I believe. And he's behind the machine gun there with the big smile. So, the exact details of the childhood story are a little unclear, but we know some things about him. Next slide. He was born in 1890 in Secondugliano, which is a town outside of Naples. And on the left is a ID card issued by the Italian Aviation Club, the international area of the Italian Aviation Club, which is part of the International Aeronautic Federation. In the middle is a picture of him in a fighter pilot. I think that's as a fighter pilot. That's a French plane that the Italians bought, about 700 models of that. And then on the right is a medal he got for being a fighter pilot, or in Italian, it would be a hunter of the skies. And as you can see, Cosimo Ranella is in the medal. Next slide, please. Later in his career, 1932, he did a circumnavigation of Ecuador with a plane that was very similar to Charles Lindbergh's that had gone over the Atlantic. It was made by the same company. And he was so famous or important in Ecuadorian aviation that the School of Aviation was named after him. The Escuela Superior Militar de Aviación Cosme Ranella Barbato, which was his last name B there. And unfortunately, he died a few years later, coming back from Ohio from a reunion of World War I pilots, ironically, and he came back and died of pneumonia. And he was a daredevil for sure, but he died of a sickness, unfortunately, he got while traveling. Next slide, please. So the next generation on the left, that's my grandfather. He's a private pilot, and I believe he was in Ecuador in this thing. But to the right is my father when he was 23 in Miami in around 1963, 64. And if you notice, it's not an Air Force uniform, it's an Army uniform. And the reason it's Army is not because he wanted to do that first, but because he failed the eye exam to become a pilot. And, so he was frustrated. He tried the Army and the Air Force and couldn't do it because of the extremely rigorous intellectual and physical requirements for any pilot, for anybody to become a pilot. So next slide, please. So at that moment, let's take a step back and let's talk about our options in telling this story. So when I, at that end, talked about my dad failing the physical, I was getting into a new theme, right? Into the intellectual and physical challenges of pilot training. And if I had kept on going in that vein, I would have ended up with two competing themes. I would have had aviation family history or intellectual and physical challenges of pilot training. I have to choose one or the other. And this is the choices that we talked about from the beginning, making good choices. Either one is interesting, right? But I can't do both. Or if I do want to do both, we go to theme 3, aviation's early history in Europe and the Americas. Now that means my family history and these physical challenges of pilot training take a back seat to there, but they can be included, right? So like I said, no idea is a bad idea. It's just, have you configured an argument that will be focused and persuasive? That is the question. So at this moment, then, I'm at a crossroads, right? The crossroads that I stuck up there in the middle, making good choices. What choice should I make? Should I do theme 1, theme 2, or theme 3? And, because all are equally interesting for the purposes of this talk, I'll go with theme 1. And we'll go to the next slide. And as Megan mentioned, I did not become a pilot. I was born on an American Army base in Germany, but I did not become a pilot, but I did write a book about aviation. So that's my that's my contribution. And then on the right is a picture of my dad about 18 years ago or 17 years ago with my son, Davis Ranella, in an airport in New Hampshire, looking at a stunt plane. And he may have given Davis the bug to fly. Next slide, please. Because now he has started taking private pilot lessons in Northampton, close to the Amherst College where he goes to school. So he may picked up the thread that Cosimo started years ago. So that's the end of that narrative. And I will just say, like I said, any one of those topics could have been interesting. The key is to choose only one. And so the final version of your paper maintains focus and has more of a chance of being appealing to the reader and to the writer, right? Writers need motivation, and if they have focus, they can get motivated too. And that's the virtue of the one idea rule. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ranella. Do we have any questions for Mark? Please feel free to type in the chat or in the Q&A box. We do have one that just came in. After being taught a concept like the one idea rule, some students still struggle to independently identify when a theme or paragraph contains more than one idea, or when a paragraph is related to but not directly aligned with the central theme. What strategies have worked for you to help students develop this skill?
Well, practice is one, right? Because if they come to you with this problem in a second paper and you can show them the first one and say, we've got the same problem here, that's extremely helpful. And they have to sort of buy into iterative work to learn about that. I guess the thing I would insist upon is to ask how does that sentence or paragraph relate to the title? Verbally, if you could actually see these people, which would be really great, in your office on Zoom, talk to me. How is this related? And obviously, in their discussion, they will have difficulty in doing that. And I think that is a demonstration for themselves. They prove to themselves that there is a disconnect between that paragraph and that main theme. So I think practice, but also some personal intervention and discussion can be helpful because it's very subtle.
Thank you. We have one more. Although clarity can have a positive impact on grammar, an ineffective writing style may continue to create confusion for the reader. In your experience as a writing coach, how have you helped students understand the difference between correct grammar and effective style so they can write more clearly?
Oh, wow, that's great. I think I like to subordinate style, let's put it that way, or subordinate the idea of style to clarity. And I think clarity is a great virtue that, for instance, when I talk in my ESL chapter, I acknowledge that a lot of ESL writers are, of course, very fluent and smart in their native languages, and they can feel very frustrated, And I said, look, you just got to buck up. You're not going to be as fluent in English as you were in Spanish or Japanese, but 80%, 90% of what you want to get across can be conveyed through clear, simpler sentences than you're trying to use. And that's what you want. You want your idea conveyed. If it's not as perfect or as beautiful as you can in your native language, that's okay. I guess that's a hard thing to stomach. I see that Mehmed asked a question. Please talk about the conclusion paradox. Okay, yes. Well, I came up with, I lived by this idea in the conclusion paradox, but it wasn't part of my original plan. It's interesting. My editor turns out to have a PhD in composition, which I am so grateful for. And I had an idea of writing as conversation. And she said, oh, that's old news. Don't do that. So I'll do something else. So I did this. And what I want to say there is that the conclusion shouldn't just, in the best writing, let's say in the best writing, this is definitely advanced. It doesn't simply say, well, we've gone over these things and please remember them. But you've done an adequate amount of discussions that you could go on to get a glimpse of the next idea that may come from that discussion, almost like coming at the end of a journey up to the top of a hill. Instead of looking back of where you came from, you look ahead to the horizon. But it's related, but different. And also very energetic way to end a piece of writing, I think.
Thank you. Any more questions for Dr. Ranella? Okay, nothing heard. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. If you're attending today and you have a question or a comment for Dr. Ranella, please reach out to us at autlc@us.af.mil and we will put you in touch with Mark. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your time and your wisdom.
I am very blessed to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.